On April 14, 1865, 5 men were supposed to die. Only one did. The others vanished into the smoke of a nation tearing itself apart. And for more than a century, the United States government pretended they never existed. The night President Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, Washington was chaos wrapped in velvet and candlelight. The Civil War was effectively over. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox just 5 days earlier. Church bells rang, flags waved, soldiers embraced strangers. A fractured nation dared to imagine healing. Inside the presidential box at Ford's Theater, laughter echoed during the third act of Our American Cousin. Then a single gunshot rewrote history. John Wilkes Booth leapt to the stage, breaking his leg, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," before fleeing into the night. That much every American schoolchild knows. What most do not know is that the original arrest warrants issued in the hours after Lincoln's assassination did not list 8 conspirators. They listed 13. The extra 5 names were quietly struck from record within 72 hours, their files sealed under direct War Department order. And one of those names belonged to a man who would later be photographed standing beside railroad magnates, shaking hands with senators, and attending the opening ceremony of the Brooklyn Bridge. His name was Thomas Calder. In April 1865, Calder was 32 years old, a former Union cavalry intelligence officer who had resigned his commission under murky circumstances 6 months before Lincoln's assassination. Officially, he had left due to medical exhaustion. Unofficially, he had been working on something so sensitive that even Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's formidable Secretary of War, insisted the details never be written down. Because by the final year of the Civil War, it was no longer just armies clashing across fields, it was networks. Telegraph wires stitched the country together like nerves. Railroads moved troops faster than ever before in human history. Ironclads changed naval warfare. Photography captured battlefields in haunting stillness. The United States had entered the modern age of war, and with it, modern intelligence. Calder's assignment in late 1864 had been simple in theory and impossible in practice: infiltrate Confederate courier systems operating between Richmond and clandestine cells in Maryland and Washington. Booth was already known to Union intelligence as a Southern sympathizer with theatrical charisma and a dangerous ego, but he was considered more nuisance than threat, a propagandist actor, not a strategist. Calder disagreed. He had intercepted coded messages referencing something called the Second Dawn. Not a battle, not a military maneuver, something else. In February 1865, Calder submitted a report warning that elements within the collapsing Confederacy were planning an act not of battlefield retaliation, but symbolic annihilation, something designed to destabilize Reconstruction before it began. The report vanished. 2 weeks later, Calder was pressured to resign. On April 14, 1865, Calder was not in Washington by accident. He had followed Booth before. He followed him again that night, but he was too late. After the gunshot, as chaos exploded inside Ford's Theater, Calder forced his way backstage. Actors screamed, soldiers shoved through curtains. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. Booth had fled through the rear alley. Calder followed. He reached the alley seconds too late to see Booth mount his horse, but he saw something else, a second rider, waiting. Booth did not escape alone. Official history would later claim he fled with David Harold, a confused accomplice who lacked both resources and strategic ability. But Calder saw the second rider clearly under gaslight. Older, composed, not panicked. and he wore a Union officer's cloak. Calder froze because he recognized him. Major Edwin Pierce, War Department Logistics. A man with access to troop movements, supply chains, and classified telegraph routes. A Union officer. Pierce met Calder's eyes for a fraction of a second before spurring his horse and disappearing into the Washington night alongside Booth. Within hours, Secretary Stanton took control of the investigation. Washington locked down, bridges sealed, patrols dispatched. Calder reported what he had seen. He was told he was mistaken. Pierce, he was informed, had been attending a reception across town that evening. Witnesses confirmed it. Alibis solidified with remarkable speed. Calder insisted. The next morning, his arrest warrant was issued, not as investigator, but as suspect. The charge, conspiracy. Because Calder's name had appeared in Booth's pocket diary, alongside 12 others. He was taken into custody before noon. As he was escorted through muddy Washington streets under armed guard, he noticed something that chilled him more than the shackles. The newspapers already had their narrative. 8 conspirators. 8, not 13. The 5 extra names, including his own, were absent. Inside Old Capitol Prison, Calder understood what was happening. Someone inside the War Department was compressing the conspiracy, shrinking it, containment. If Union officers were implicated, if evidence suggested deeper infiltration, Reconstruction itself could collapse before it began. The country was exhausted. The public needed a villain, preferably a dead one. Booth would serve, the others would hang, and the rest would vanish. But Calder was not alone in that cell block. 2 cells down sat another of the erased names, Samuel Avery, telegraph engineer, contracted by the War Department during the war to oversee encrypted military communications between Washington and Grant's headquarters. Avery had also submitted irregularity reports in early April 1865, specifically about unauthorized message rerouting on April 13th, the night before the assassination. Messages that never reached their intended recipients. Grant had been invited to attend Ford's Theater that night. He declined at the last moment, officially due to travel fatigue. Unofficially, his wife later hinted at unease. Inside prison walls, Calder and Avery pieced together fragments. Pierce had overseen supply reallocation near the Navy Yard the week before April 14. Booth had inexplicably moved through Washington checkpoints without hindrance. Telegraph traffic that night had been selectively delayed, and someone had anticipated Lincoln's reduced security presence at Ford's Theater. This was not a desperate actor's improvisation. This was structured, layered, protected. 3 days later, as the nation mourned its fallen president, Secretary Stanton made a quiet visit to Old Capitol Prison. He entered Calder's cell alone. Stanton was a brilliant man, ruthless when necessary, loyal to Lincoln above all. His eyes were red from sleepless nights. "You believe Pierce is involved," Stanton said flatly. "I saw him," Calder replied. Stanton studied him for a long moment. "Then you understand why that cannot be true. Truth does not bend for stability." Stanton's jaw tightened. "No," he said softly, "but nations do." Booth was cornered and shot in a Virginia tobacco barn 12 days later. The public demanded swift justice. Military tribunals convened. 4 conspirators were hanged. History recorded closure. But in June 1865, under cover of routine prisoner transfer, Calder and Avery were not released. They were relocated. Not to another prison, to a secure townhouse in Georgetown under War Department supervision. There, Stanton presented them with a choice. Public trial would likely end in execution, guilty by association regardless of evidence. Or they could continue their investigation, quietly, unofficially. Because Stanton had found something in Booth's recovered documents that troubled him. A list, not of names, of cities: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, St. Louis, Boston, each marked with dates stretching into 1866. Booth had intended more than assassination. He had intended destabilization, economic sabotage, rail disruption, telegraph interference. And if Pierce or men like him were embedded within Union infrastructure, the threat did not die with Booth. Thus began what no textbook would ever describe: America's first unofficial domestic intelligence operation. Calder and Avery operated in shadows, tracing financial transfers through New York banks that had quietly funded Confederate espionage rings. They followed rail contracts, manipulated to reroute Reconstruction supply lines. They discovered coded advertisements in newspapers signaling surviving cells. And in November 1865, in a warehouse near the Brooklyn docks, they found Pierce, alive. Not hiding, meeting with industrial investors, men who would later become titans of American infrastructure. Pierce did not run when Calder confronted him. He smiled. "Do you truly believe this was about the Confederacy?" Pierce asked. "The war ended at Appomattox." "No," Pierce replied calmly. "The war changed form." He spoke of industrial acceleration, of how war had proven the power of centralized logistics, rapid communication, consolidated capital. He believed Lincoln's vision of Reconstruction threatened certain financial interests, Southern and Northern alike. Instability, he argued, created opportunity: rail contracts, steel expansion, telegraph monopolies. A fractured nation required rebuilding. Rebuilding required infrastructure. Infrastructure required men like him. And Lincoln, Calder demanded? A martyr unifies faster than a politician. Calder lunged. Gunfire erupted. Pierce escaped into the maze of New York streets. But the scale of the conspiracy crystallized. This was not Southern revenge. It was economic transformation weaponized. Over the next decade, Calder and Avery would trace threads linking former Confederate agents, Northern financiers, railroad syndicates, and emerging oil barons. They would uncover forged telegraph orders that redirected troop movements during Reconstruction riots. They would expose engineered bank panics that transferred wealth upward while Southern states collapsed into debt peonage. And in 1873, when the Panic of 1873 triggered one of the worst financial crises in American history, Calder recognized patterns he had seen before: deliberate contraction, manufactured scarcity. Because the men who understood war logistics understood markets, and they were reshaping the United States. But by then, Pierce had become respectable. Photographed beside senators, funding railroads that bound the continent, standing at ceremonies celebrating American progress. History would call it the Gilded Age. Calder called it Phase 2. And in 1883, at the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, as fireworks illuminated the East River, Calder saw Pierce across the crowd. Older, wealthier, untouchable. Pierce raised a champagne glass slightly in Calder's direction, a silent acknowledgement. The war had never truly ended. It had evolved. And somewhere in the machinery of American expansion, rail steel stretching westward, oil derricks piercing Pennsylvania soil, telegraph wires humming across plains, the blueprint first drafted in the shadows of April 1865 continued unfolding. Because Booth had fired one shot, but others had been loading the future for years. And America, racing toward modernity, did not yet realize how much of its destiny had been engineered in darkness. The fireworks above the East River burst in white and red constellations, reflected in the dark water like fractured stars, and the crowd roared as if noise itself could declare the United States invincible. It was May 24, 1883. The Brooklyn Bridge, a steel cathedral strung between two boroughs, stood complete at last. Politicians spoke of destiny. Newspapers called it proof that America had outgrown Europe. Children waved miniature flags. Bands played Hail Columbia. The Gilded Age glittered. Thomas Calder stood near the edge of the promenade, his hat brim low, watching not the bridge, but the men standing beneath it. Edwin Pierce was among them. Pierce had aged well. Silver threaded his dark hair, but his posture remained straight, his gaze sharp. He wore a tailored coat and spoke easily with investors from Boston and Chicago. Photographers hovered nearby, eager to capture the faces of those who built modern America. Pierce belonged in those photographs. Calder did not. Beside Calder was Samuel Avery, thinner now, spectacles thicker, hands permanently ink-stained from years of decoding telegraph traffic that few knew existed. They had spent nearly 18 years chasing fragments of a conspiracy that had never been formally acknowledged, never been prosecuted, never been written into any public ledger. Yet its fingerprints were everywhere. "Do you see him?" Avery murmured. "I've never stopped seeing him," Calder replied. The band crescendoed, fireworks boomed, a speaker praised American industry, American innovation, American resilience after Civil War. Calder's thoughts drifted back to 1866, when the first threads had led them north. After Pierce escaped confrontation in that Brooklyn warehouse years earlier, Calder and Avery followed financial ledgers through a maze of shell companies. They found Confederate cotton bonds, quietly repurchased at steep discounts by northern banks, only to surge in value once Reconstruction governments stabilized trade. They found rail construction contracts awarded to firms whose backers had quietly funded both Union logistics and Southern espionage. It was not ideology that bound these men, it was capital. The Civil War had cost the United States over 600,000 lives and billions of dollars. Entire Southern economies lay in ruin. Infrastructure in both North and South required rebuilding on a scale unprecedented in human history. War had proven something profound. Whoever controlled transportation and communication controlled power. Telegraph wires were arteries, railroads were muscle, steel was bone. Pierce had understood that before most generals. By late 1866, Calder and Avery traced him to Pittsburgh, where iron foundries were transitioning into steel production under a new process imported from England, the Bessemer method. It allowed molten pig iron to be converted into steel rapidly and cheaply by blasting air through it to remove impurities. Steel would change everything, and men who positioned themselves early would shape the century. Pierce had invested quietly in multiple rail corridors stretching westward, lines that would eventually feed into what became the Pennsylvania Railroad network. He also appeared in correspondence with financiers backing the expansion of oil drilling in western Pennsylvania. The oil fields. In 1859, Edwin Drake had struck oil near Titusville, launching America's petroleum age. By the late 1860s, oil was replacing whale oil for lamps and lubricating the machinery of industrial growth. and wherever Calder looked, he found Pierce adjacent to emerging monopolies. Not at their head, never visibly in command, but present, connected, advising. The first time Calder attempted to bring evidence to a federal prosecutor, he was met with polite dismissal. "Mr. Calder," the prosecutor said carefully, "you are suggesting that respected industrialists colluded with Confederate agents to destabilize federal authority after the war. That is a grave accusation. It is a documented one. Documented in private ledgers and intercepted telegrams whose origins cannot be publicly verified." The prosecutor leaned back. "The country is exhausted. Reconstruction is fragile. Do you imagine Congress will pursue indictments against men financing rail expansion into the Midwest?" Calder had no answer, because the prosecutor was right about one thing. The country was exhausted. In the South, federal troops enforced new constitutional amendments abolishing slavery and granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. Resistance hardened into paramilitary terror groups. Violence erupted in Memphis, New Orleans, and across rural counties. The Ku Klux Klan spread like a shadow war. Meanwhile, in the North, industry surged. Rail mileage doubled between 1865 and 1873. Cities expanded upward and outward. Immigration accelerated, feeding factories with labor, and money flowed. In 1869, the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit linked the Atlantic and Pacific by rail for the first time. The nation celebrated again, unity forged by iron rather than blood. But Calder knew the Transcontinental Railroad had been financed through a tangle of government bonds, land grants, and private speculation so complex that oversight was nearly impossible. He and Avery began mapping what they called the lattice, a network diagram of shared directors, silent investors, and legal proxies across banks, rail companies, telegraph firms, and steel manufacturers. The same names surfaced repeatedly. Some had flirted with Confederate trade networks during the war, hedging bets on both sides. Others had profited from war contracts and now pivoted to Reconstruction projects. Pierce sat at intersections within that lattice, always slightly removed from scandal, always insulated. In 1871, the New York Times exposed corruption within Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed's political machine. Public outrage erupted. Reformers demanded accountability. Calder saw opportunity. Corruption investigations might expose deeper networks. He arranged a discreet meeting with a reform-minded state senator in Albany, presenting evidence that certain railroad bonds were being manipulated to influence Reconstruction funding allocations in southern states. The senator listened intently. "This is beyond Tweed," he said slowly. "Yes," Calder replied, "it predates him." "Then you are asking for something larger than reform." "I am asking for transparency." The senator hesitated. "You are asking for war with men who can bankrupt newspapers." The investigation stalled. But in 1873, something broke that no quiet reform could have achieved. J. Cook and Company, one of the nation's most prominent investment banks, collapsed under the weight of overextended railroad financing. Panic rippled through Wall Street. The stock market closed for 10 days. Businesses failed. Unemployment soared. The panic of 1873 ushered in what became known as the Long Depression. Calder walked through Manhattan that autumn and saw bread lines stretching down streets once crowded with carriage traffic. Factories shuttered. Construction halted mid-skeleton. He also saw consolidation. Stronger firms swallowed weaker ones. Assets transferred quietly at fractions of prior valuations. Avery laid telegram intercepts across their table in a rented room above a print shop. "Look at the dates," Avery said. Calder traced them. Several weeks before Jay Cook's collapse, Pierce had liquidated specific railroad holdings and shifted capital into steel and telegraph ventures less exposed to bond volatility. He had anticipated the crash, or helped engineer conditions that made it inevitable. "You think he triggered it?" Avery asked. "No," Calder said slowly, "but he knew which domino would fall first." The Depression intensified labor unrest. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike erupted after wage cuts by major rail lines. Workers in West Virginia walked off the job. The strike spread to Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. Rail traffic halted, riots erupted. Federal troops were deployed to suppress violence. Calder watched as soldiers fired on American workers in Pittsburgh. The same steel mills Pierce had invested in now produced rails guarded by armed men against citizens demanding wages. Industrial power had become sovereign, and the federal government, reliant on that power for economic recovery, could not easily confront it. During the strike, Calder received an unsigned note. "Meet me at the Astor House, midnight." He went armed. In a dim private dining room, Pierce waited alone. "You have been persistent," Pierce said calmly. "You have been fortunate," Calder replied. Pierce poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "The panic was inevitable," Pierce said. "Speculation outran productivity. You positioned yourself ahead of it, as did others who understood market signals. You manipulated telegraph traffic during the war." Pierce's eyes flickered. "Allegations again?" "You rerouted military messages the night Lincoln was shot." Pierce leaned back. "Do you know what terrified me most in April 1865?" he asked quietly. "Discovery? Disorder." He leaned forward. "Lincoln was a brilliant wartime president, but Reconstruction required speed, capital, centralization. The South needed rebuilding before European powers exploited weakness. Investors required assurance that federal authority would stabilize the continent. And Assassination provided that? Martyrdom unified political will in ways compromise never could." Calder's hand tightened around his glass. "You justify murder as infrastructure." "I justify continuity," Pierce replied. Outside, carriage wheels clattered over cobblestone. Pierce stood. "You cannot stop industrialization, Thomas. You cannot arrest progress. The nation is expanding. Rail lines will reach California, then Alaska. Steel will frame cities taller than church spires. Oil will power fleets. Do you truly believe this could occur without ruthless coordination? You are not coordination, Thomas. You are coercion." Pierce paused at the door. "The difference," he said softly, "is often semantic." He left before Calder could respond. In the years that followed, the lattice tightened. John D. Rockefeller consolidated oil under Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie expanded steel production. Cornelius Vanderbilt dominated rail networks. J.P. Morgan restructured failing firms into stable monopolies. America became an industrial titan. And Pierce's name surfaced repeatedly in advisory boards, private financing pools, and transatlantic investment consortia. Never publicly scandalized, never prosecuted. Calder aged alongside the century's transformation. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Telephone lines supplemented telegraph wires. Immigration flooded Ellis Island. Skyscrapers pierced Manhattan's skyline. But beneath visible progress, the same pattern persisted: consolidation through crisis. When smaller refineries attempted to compete, railroad freight rates mysteriously favored Standard Oil. When independent telegraph companies expanded, contracts shifted suddenly toward Western Union. Avery traced rate changes back to meetings attended by Pierce. "You think he coordinates them all?" Avery asked one evening in 1888. "No," Calder said. "He doesn't need to. He ensures they speak." "And if they refuse?" "Markets have a way of disciplining dissent." In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, aimed at curbing monopolies. Reformers hailed it as a turning point. Calder was less optimistic. Enforcement depended on political will, and political campaigns depended on industrial financing. Still, cracks appeared. Journalists began investigating corporate abuses. Ida Tarbell would later expose Standard Oil's practices. Labor organizers demanded rights. Farmers protested railroad pricing. America's democratic mechanisms strained against concentrated wealth. In 1893, another panic struck, deeper than the last. Banks failed. Railroads declared bankruptcy. Unemployment soared again. Calder, now in his 60s, felt time closing. He and Avery compiled their findings into a comprehensive dossier, tracing from April '65 through decades of coordinated capital movements, telegraph manipulations, bond collapses, and industrial consolidations. It was not a courtroom brief. It was a historical indictment. They delivered copies to 3 individuals: a reform senator, a prominent investigative journalist, and a federal judge known for independence. Weeks passed, then months. The journalist published a partial exposé on railroad rate discrimination, but omitted any reference to Lincoln's assassination or wartime telegraph interference. The senator introduced modest regulatory legislation, diluted in committee. The judge retired to health. And Pierce attended a banquet celebrating American expansion into overseas markets following the Spanish-American War in 1898. America now projected power beyond its continental borders. Industry fueled empire. Calder attended the banquet uninvited, standing at the edge of the hall. Pierce saw him. Age had finally bent his shoulders slightly, but his gaze remained clear. "You see," Pierce said quietly when they stood face to face once more, "the nation did not collapse." "It changed," replied Calder, "as all nations must. You gambled with democracy. I invested in stability." Calder shook his head. "You confuse control with order." Pierce's expression softened unexpectedly. "You think history is pure?" he asked. "It is negotiated, contested, directed by those willing to act when others hesitate." "And what of the cost?" Pierce did not answer immediately. "Every generation," he said at last, "inherits decisions made in shadows." In 1901, when President William McKinley was assassinated and Theodore Roosevelt assumed office, trust-busting intensified. Antitrust suits targeted monopolies. Public sentiment shifted toward regulation. Pierce withdrew from visible advisory roles. He died quietly in 1904, obituary columns praising his contributions to industrial growth. No mention of April 1865. No mention of rerouted telegrams. No mention of the Second Dawn. Samuel Avery died 2 years later, his eyesight nearly gone. Thomas Calder lived until 1910. In his final years, he organized his papers meticulously, labeling correspondence, cross-referencing financial ledgers with telegraph logs, annotating dates that tied moments of national crisis to private meetings among powerful men. He did not write accusations in anger. He wrote history as he had witnessed it. On the last page of his final notebook, he penned a single line: "The Republic survives not because corruption fails, but because exposure eventually exceeds coordination." His archive would remain boxed in a private law office for decades, occasionally referenced, rarely fully examined. But as the 20th century unfolded through world wars, depressions, and further consolidations of power, patterns Calder had traced in the 1860s resurfaced in new forms. Crisis, consolidation, stability purchased at hidden cost. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands, steel cables taut over the East River, carrying millions across its span each year. Few who cross it know that beneath its opening fireworks stood a man who believed he had engineered a nation's future from behind the curtain of tragedy. Fewer still know that another man stood watching him, refusing to forget the night 5 names were erased from a warrant. History remembers the shot in Ford's Theater. It rarely remembers the silence that followed. But in the quiet spaces between official records and lived reality, the story of America's transformation from war-torn republic to industrial superpower carries shadows long enough to reach across centuries. And sometimes, if you look carefully at moments of national crisis, at who benefits, who consolidates, who anticipates collapse before it arrives, you can almost see the faint outline of a lattice drawn long ago. Not to destroy the nation, but to shape it. Whether that shaping saved the United States or compromised it remains a question each generation must answer for itself.